I'm Robin Lewis, founder of the Robin Report, and I'm very pleased this morning to welcome Ethan Chernofsky from Placer.ai, who's joining us for our third update on the state of retail. I mean, Ethan, in my opinion, has more insights and interesting observations on the industry than most of the experts I know. He's amazing. So while you are digesting all of what he's got to say, be sure to put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of our session. So welcome, Ethan. We are eager to hear your overview once again, and then, of course, a deeper dive into what's on everyone's mind this holiday season. So, Ethan, take it away. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's always very exciting for me to be here and get to have these conversations. Bear with me as I kind of load up the deck. Just, as we always do, I want to start with just a super brief introduction for those of you who are new to Placer and what we do and where our data comes from. So Placer is a location data company. What that means in the simplest possible terms is people vote with their feet, and we're showing you how they vote every single day across the United States in retail locations. How do we get this data? We observe a panel of 30 million devices. It is all anonymized aggregate data, so we are GDPR and CCPA compliant. We then analyze this data with AI and machine learning algorithms in order to make estimations on the traffic to any retail location in the US. And we present that data in a wealth of different reports within our platform on everything from true trade areas, visit counts, the customer journey, void analysis, and a whole lot more. For anyone who is interested, we have a free version of our premium product at our website at Placer.ai. And there is also a whole bunch of free tools in a section on our website called The Square that can be found again at Placer.ai-The Square. And with that, Robin, I think we can dive into it.
Great, go away with it. So, what have we learned about offline retail?
I mean, so it's interesting because, like, if you think about where we started the year, let's even take a step further back. Let's think about where we started in 2019 and late 2018, and it was this predominant retail apocalypse narrative, and then hits this pandemic, which essentially wiped so much of brick and mortar retail and put them, out and put them in a situation where they couldn't even be open. And so it was, in theory, for those who were a proponent of that narrative, it was the worst possible timing for a very poorly situated industry. And yet what we've seen in the last year and a half is that kind of this wider narrative of the demise of brick and mortar retail has been, to put it nicely, nonsense, right? And it doesn't mean that everything is rosy, but it also means that we fundamentally underestimated just how significant and lasting the importance is. And what we've seen in the last few months is this really consistent recovery. And it speaks to this very central piece, which is however strong these other channels that we love to talk about are within the retail landscape, for the most part, brick and mortar retail is still the core. And it's the core for a lot of reasons. Part of it is just how we're used to shopping and the way we want to consume goods. Part of it is, the ability to touch and feel, but part of it is also the longevity that some of these channels have. So, we've spoken about this in the past, but when we talk about physical retail, we don't talk enough about what's the marketing impact of being able to walk into a store. What's the e-commerce uplift of having a location and having that kind of billboard of, hey, we're here? What's the impact of having a fitting room, of touching and feeling a product? What's the impact of the last mile distribution or the ability to do returns? All of these elements not only give brick and mortar retail value today, but they situate brick and mortar retail to be a really significant piece of the puzzle moving forward. And so I think if we've had one huge lesson, it's that essentially underestimate the power of brick and mortar retail at your own risk. It doesn't, again, mean that innovation on the digital side or all of these elements of how we evolve the sector forward don't need to take place, but it means that viewing it as there is this digital wave that's going to wipe out brick and mortar retail is a silly notion.
Totally agree. So, give us a sign of the things that are to come yet.
So, I mean, what's been interesting about this holiday season, and I think what we've been really fascinated by was what we knew to expect from a risk perspective walking in than what played out. So we talk a lot about this idea of like the extended holiday season, and we think about what was happening in the buildup. So there's significant labor shortages. We have really significant supply chain challenges globally and domestically. So imagine shifts in demand, how that impacts supply chain, not just how do I get products to the US, but how do I make sure they're in the right store? And what we saw a lot of brands do is try to push the season earlier. So we're not going to be open on Thanksgiving necessarily. In many cases, these chains weren't. We know that Black Friday might be diminished, and it was. So we're going to try and push the season earlier. And what's really interesting for that is, I think, three really important factors. The first is the power that retailers have shown to own the calendar. So essentially, there's this big challenge that's facing them, and they're able to take action in order to offset that challenge by pushing sales earlier in the holiday season. The second key element here is that they're able to find mutual benefit. So they're able to communicate a narrative that says, hey, consumer or customer, it's going to be better for you if you shop earlier in the season. It's not just about what's better for us. And that's a really significant element because it speaks to what people can do moving forward, that there is this capacity to say, hey, what's good for me as the retail can be good for the customer as well. And there's a way for me to communicate that in such a manner that I don't lose my brand relationship with the customer. And then the last bit is this ability to kind of deliver on promises. So we saw so many brands talk about shop early because we're going to make sure you have the product in time for the holidays, and they delivered. We saw a brand like Target talked about this with in their earnings call. Even though prices went up, they didn't pass along those price increases to their customer. They kind of stomached it themselves. And this idea of, in the short term, I'm going to take less profit than I could so I can stand up to this commitment I have to my customers to have prices that make sense for them, is a really smart long-term element. And I think it's going to be important when we look back at we start seeing these earnings reports covering the holidays in January and beyond. We need to remember that a lot of brands are making a long-term commitment in their relationship with their customer, even if it might create a short-term negative.
I think that's a very important insight, Ethan. Really, it is who's going to blink first, the consumer or the retailer. And I think retailers are going to blink because they just aren't going to be able to raise prices to the extent they want to. And the guys with deeper pockets like Target and Walmart are obviously able to do that a lot easier. But that's a great observation that you're making. So is the day on the decline?
So when we talk about, again, Black Friday, this is not a new conversation. We've been speaking about it for a while is Black Friday what it was? And I think the very simple answer is no. Black Friday, especially this year, was not as significant as it had been in the past. It's still very important to qualify. It was incredibly significant. It was a kind of dominant, huge retail day, clearly the height of the retail calendar for many brands, even if the peak wasn't as high as it's been in the past. And so I think that there's two really interesting things from our perspective here. One, that yes, it did decline, but the decline was still, it's still the number one day for most retailers. So we need to take that into account when we're kind of expecting this, long-term decline of Black Friday. But then two, I think what was really fascinating was it maintained this relative strength without being as oriented towards price slashing. So in the past, it was come on Black Friday because you're going to get this item 40% off. Oh, they're going to give it to you for 40% off. We're going to give it to you for 50% off. And it's race to the bottom with pricing. And I think what we've seen instead this year is a lot of brands holding steady on their products. And especially in the luxury sector, that's a really significant opportunity to say, I don't have to cut my prices. I can have items that you want. I can provide an experience that you want. And that shift is significant, and I expect it to carry over into coming years, where a lot of brands are learning it's not just about having the cheapest item, it's about having the item that people want and having the brand they want to connect with. And I think when you think about the ability of a retailer to charge more for a product, they can provide a better overall experience. When I have to cut my prices constantly, it's everyone essentially trying to jam themselves into this value lane. And it doesn't work for a lot of these brands. And that's why we've seen these declines. This ability to say, hey, I can make a good margin on my product means I can invest more in my product and invest more in my experience to allow it to align with the kind of more upscale or even middle tier experience that I want to provide.
Yeah, great point. No great doorbusters, right? This year. Yeah, where people just would, clamor to get in there for the one item. Yeah, it's a whole different way of valuing your products and what your offerings. Good point. So how important is the experience around retail?
So for us, I think one of the things that we expected going into this year, and it's something we've been seeing across the retail landscape, is that the setting matters more than it ever has before. So it's not just about convenience. It's not just about getting everything done in one day. And it's not just about kind of these doorbusters like we discussed. It's about this wider experience you can have. And it's all the elements that surround that. And it's a really significant change within retail. So when we think about how down indoor malls were on Black Friday, we saw a decline of almost 8.5% compared to 2019. Oh. When we look at the wider weekend, so that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they were down only 4.9%, which means Saturday was a little bit better in terms of it still declines, but still a little bit better. And Sunday actually saw visits up. And the question is, what's drawing people? And it's not just the shopping. It's this ability to have a wider experience. So if I go to the mall, I take in a movie in the afternoon, I grab a lunch, maybe I stick around for dinner too. I do whatever is in this wider surroundings because it's not only the apparel shopping experience that I'm looking for. And what's interesting is it's pushing this idea that we've already seen happening for a few years of a more nuanced approach to what belongs in a shopping center. So if in the past we were pretty centered around this is what we expect to see in a mall, there's more mall owners who are saying those expectations don't need to carry anymore. We can do a mix that's a little bit more interesting and different because it's going to get people to have a longer experience within our mall. And then especially if we think we can cut down the amount of apparel we put in as a result, it allows each one of those apparel retailers to do better and have a larger piece of the pie to fight over. And this shift is not small. It's incredibly significant because it's allowing landlords and mall owners and shopping center owners to really take center stage and look at the experience I can provide for you. This is how shopping is going to move. And I can start creating this better environment that's going to attract specific types of retailers. And I think that interaction is super interesting and one that's going to carry very significantly into the next few years.
Major message to our mall developers, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Better get on it because it is so important. So what can we learn from an overperforming sector? Why does it matter for the rest of retail?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we have a day that one of the things that was really interesting when we were just kind of kicking off our marketing efforts at Placer was there was one day in the calendar that really surpassed all others for the grocery space. And it was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, a day that we very lovingly, declared as Turkey Wednesday. And what's interesting is you see this sector that has been overperforming, doing really, really well. And yet it's even as, because of the pandemic nature, because again, dining's closed, you have to get your stuff from the supermarket. And yet, even as retail is recovering, they're maintaining their strength. And so what's really interesting here is two separate things. One is how has grocery been able to maintain this strength? And part of it is we have these lightning in a bottle moments in retail where the stars align and give you a really significant boost. How many sectors know how to take full advantage of that moment to give the type of experience that's going to keep someone coming back over and over again? So it's not just about the fact that, hey, everything worked for me on this given weekend, so I saw a ton of traffic, but I was able to so deliver on my promise that as time went on, you're going to keep on coming back for more. But there's also this element, and I'll call out a brand that we really love with this is Starbucks. If you look at Starbucks visits, one of their strongest days consistently is Black Friday, because essentially we go out, we have this long shopping day, we're perusing whatever department store or apparel retailer we like. At some point we get sick of it, we need to refuel. We go to Starbucks, we get ourselves a coffee, maybe a muffin or a donut or a Danish, and we move on with our day. they take advantage of the fact that there's something happening alongside them that they can position themselves within. What's interesting is how many retailers recognize that grocery is so huge and significant on that day, and how many of them are prepared to take advantage. So you have to go do that run to the supermarket to buy the items you need. Am I pushing things that might be, a secondary to that, but as you're part of that shop, you're going to take advantage? And just think about Target and Walmart. They also see this massive jump on those days because they have grocery components. So they can address part of the need. But if you walk into a Target or Walmart to get, milk and spices, your chances that you're only leaving with those two things are minimal. So it's this, how do I understand both at the shopping center level and at the specific store level, what's happening around me, where the demand is, and how I can align myself with that demand in order to take advantage.
Good points. So who is positioned for an extended holiday push?
So for what's the one thing that we find really interesting is there is this a very large number of retailers who they see their build into Black Friday. Black Friday delivers the biggest day of the year for retail visits. And then we see a decline back into the rest of December. There's, some interesting peaks here and there, but nothing matches Black Friday. And then there are other retailers who see a different pattern, which is Black Friday is not the height of the season. Actually, the pre-Christmas period is. And there are some brands that seem incredibly well positioned, not just for what they've done already, but the fact that their best is yet to come. So Walmart traditionally sees more visits the 3 days before Christmas than they do, Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Saturday in a normal year when they would have visits on Thanksgiving. Off-price retail sees more visits in December than they do in November. So these are sectors that if you thought they were already having a good year, expect an explosion in the end of the year because they're able to deliver on promises and they're able to provide something at a time when no one else is. And it fits so perfectly with especially a brick and mortar oriented retail space like off-price retail. So you've gone and you've done this big shop, you've gone to the mall, you've visited the places you want to go to, but then you're sitting there 2 weeks before Christmas and you don't have everything. Or you want to do that trip with the money you have left over to get some other things, and popping into that physical retail experience in an off-price retailer can be really significant. And so what's fascinating is I think we're going to see more retailers ask, how do they orient themselves around these two shifts? So in the past, it was everything. How do we put all of our kind of chips on Black Friday and hope in the roulette wheel of retail that it ends up landing on Black Friday? But instead, if I can extend the season earlier, why can't I extend it later? Why can't I figure out a way to encourage or that sense of urgency on that retail visit in the build up to Christmas too? And, maybe it's, I forgot my present day, or, whatever else you want to call it. But how do I get the customer in the mindset of going to one of these locations later on in the year, especially when the fact that, look, I have it in store, you don't have to wait for it to be delivered online, can be a really interesting selling point.
Ethan, that's a great point for these retailers. I don't know how many of them are thinking in that way, that it's not just Black Friday. There's a lot of time ahead of us before Christmas. Another interesting thing that Black Friday used to be a trade term that we would all use. I mean, consumers are talking about Black Friday now, which is very interesting. Yeah, amazing. So anyway, can the lessons be applied elsewhere here?
So I think when we think about like the winners of who did really well, let's take a few groups. So Walmart, Target, these are kind of the kings. They have this really wide array of items. They can kind of take advantage of whatever is driving the consumer demand. There's a reason to go to Target or Walmart to fulfill it. And therefore we have all this kind of cross-sell, et cetera. That's a really difficult thing to replicate if I'm the average retailer, just because that scale and scope is really difficult to find. I think when you think about things like off-price, all of a sudden there's some really interesting elements. So off-price, what do? They emphasize their physical store experience. They downplay, if they have it at all, the online. And there's elements to say here, hey, all right, now that you've done your shopping, you've done the bulk of it, why aren't you coming in and see what was left over, see what we have? Generate this degree of excitement of what the experience can be in a specific store. But I also think there's an interesting sector that did a lot better than I think we had expected in the department store space. And so was it the greatest success ever? Absolutely not. Did it match what they've done in years past on Black Friday? No. But overall, they're trending in a really positive direction. And I think a big part of the reason is the discovery concept. So why is it that we're going to a department store? It's the fact that it has all of these things in one place. And so the question is, how are you emphasizing discovery as a part of your process? And very critically, this doesn't mean that you need to have every sale happen in a store. It means that there are certain elements that are better in a store than they would be online. One of my favorite data points was if you looked at data from an online intelligence company, the cross-shopping online between Nike and Lululemon was less than 10%. So the people who visited both websites, which means that people were going with conviction. So when I go to lululemon.com, I know exactly what I want. I know who I'm looking for. The fascinating thing is, so where does the discovery happen? Where does that choice take place when I'm deciding which brand I want to go to? It takes place offline. It takes place in the commercials we see. It takes place in the ads that we're consuming. And so this idea that what I can accomplish with that discovery process needs to change and needs to be central. And I think there are some really amazing brands who understand that the in-store experience is about finding the right thing. It's not just about purchasing the right thing in the moment. And the more we embrace that idea, the better off retail will be as a whole.
Yeah, that was the foundation upon which department stores originated. Very interesting. So, going forward, the strongest brands extended their position, right? Can it be challenged?
So what's interesting is, I think in some cases, the answer is no, right? I don't think. I mean, obviously, there's caveats to this. You watch companies like Dollar General grow stronger, BJ's in the wholesale club space go stronger, but players like Costco and Walmart and Target are just so established, but even more than that, they're so invested in the future that it's really difficult to imagine this world where their dominant position gets overly whittled away. And again, the huge element here is they're not resting on their laurels. We talk all the time about innovation with Target. They were investing in innovation years before it was relevant. They're willing to have that painful period where they're investing in something that doesn't have an immediate return in order to benefit from the success later. And so how many retailers are really willing to do that? The ones who are I think are succeeding in a much more significant way. Other sectors that are really fascinating is look at beauty. Beauty did this space where, all right, we didn't need makeup so much anymore, but they were still seeing a boost because they have other products that did fit. So lotions and creams and more wellness-oriented products were doing really well. But now we have the same kind of trending towards health and wellness and what makes me feel good. But then also the return of going back to work, the return of events, which gives this kind of makeup sector a significant boost. So I think we're going to see a really powerful year for beauty. And I think the last one is, I know this is like somewhat silly, but the coffee space, this idea of, returns of routine. When I go back to work, I stop at my favorite coffee place underneath my office and I grab a coffee in the morning, right? That return is really significant. But then also work from home as this establishment of the value of the third place, that space that I'm going to go to in the middle of the day to get out of my house for a few hours, that also benefits them. And that combined element seems to be creating this groundswell that's going to drive a lot of significant value for chains who are focused on that morning segment, but also that kind of get away, have a cup of coffee space.
Very good. So, how do we understand the steps back and steps forward?
So I think we need to see things within these wider trends. And I want to hit on a few that we think are going to heavily define what we're going to see in the coming year. So the first is something that we're calling the Great Regression, right? So the Great Regression is this idea that we saw really unique trends in the last 2019 and 2020 especially, but we're seeing things come back to earth. So take home improvement. Home improvement was one of the darlings of the pandemic in the sense that they were essential retail. People could have this time to go and invest in, a do-it-yourself project or their backyard patio, and they did so. And we saw visits surge. And then expectedly this year, we saw visits drop back year over year, but they're still way up year over 2 years. So the success was still there for the home improvement sector. Yet it was impossible that that level of success sustained. So we see this regression back to the norm. And the same is true in reverse. So think about a sector like fitness or movie theaters that got hit really, really hard. They're not all dying. Many of them are now rebounding in a really nice way back towards that norm. And so I think we need to understand that that's going to carry a lot of weight, not just this year, but also next year. And even more than that, the regressions that did take place that year, this year, we need to have them in mind when we're analyzing these companies. So when we look at Home Depot, there's a very good chance we're going to see very minimal gains, if gains at all, in overall visits, potentially even in overall sales for some of these brands looking year over year. That doesn't mean they're in a weaker place than they were before. It just means they had this really unique surge. I'll give one anecdote that I love for this is when we first started, we were at a convention and someone asked us to look at data for South Coast Plaza in California. And we were looking at the data and we saw that there was a decline year over year in these certain months. And we were like, oh, that's not good. And the person talking to us was like, nope, that's actually an anomaly in the early part of your data. What you're looking at is a Kim Kardashian pop-up shop that lasted for about 4 months and drove a huge swell of visits. And yet, so context is really important to remember the how and why, so we don't get overly caught up in the moment. And that's going to be a really significant element next year. Another element, and is why we have Warby Parker here, is this wider push of digitally native and product-oriented companies into the retail space. So the fact that they're coming offline is significant for a lot of reasons. One, it's this tremendous validation of the power of brick and mortar retail for a lot of the reasons we discussed before. They see all of these other values that they can create from a retail location. By the way, one of the big ones that we've noticed quite a bit is the cost of customer acquisition, how expensive it is to grab someone online, get them to come to my site with a low conversion rate. And the idea that stores can actually be a valuable asset in that marketing mix. But there's all these other elements too, the ability to take in returns, the ability to improve delivery, the ability to kind of actually drive sales from the store, let people touch and feel, but even the store as a platform. So imagine, I don't visit Warby Parker to get other items, but if I'm in a Warby Parker location, how difficult is it for them to start upselling me other things? It's much easier. And so this push is really significant because it's giving a lot of added validity to brick and mortar locations, but also because it's bringing a lot more diversity to the mix. So the more retailers that comes in, the longer that long tail stretches, the better, because it means more optionality for the shopping center owner to make the ideal mix in each space. It means more diversity so that one shopping center doesn't look exactly like the other, or one mall doesn't look exactly like the other, but there can be this interesting mix between them. And these elements come together to create something really powerful. I mean, the last one we talk a lot about is health. We look at CVS talking about health services. We look at Walgreens and Walmart doing the same. This idea of there are basic services that I'm comfortable getting at my pharmacy or my local Walmart is a really significant shift because it's a powerful asset for these companies. And it's also it's taking the trust that these brands have developed to another direction. And I'll say the first place I really ever noticed it was at Costco. Costco has, you could get a hearing aid at Costco, which to me is like, okay, that's not something I'd expect from the place that I can buy like a massive jar of pickles. Yet people love and trust Costco to such an extent that when that element rolls out, they're willing to buy into it. And I think we're going to see more brands try to figure out what are these service areas where I can leverage my brand relationship to kind of offer other elements to my mix.
Ethan, that's terrific. I did an article on just that, and Costco and a lot of others are following in this service, but I think Costco, 30% of Costco's revenues come from services that they offer. And you're right, the consumer, they trust them for everything because it's a brand that they're loyal to. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So which tactics will define retail success next year?
So I think there's three things that we're looking at that are really interesting to us, and we'll kind of list them at the top. But the first is Omni, and we've spoken about Omni ad nauseum. And I think it's especially important in the recent weeks. We've heard of a lot of retailers who are, should we split offline and online? And again, I'm no oracle, but I can tell you, in my opinion, nothing seems more out of touch with what retailers need to actually be doing. And there was a great article in the Robin Report discussing just this.
Thank you.
I think that the idea that ultimately you're trying to serve the customer and you're trying to put the customer at the forefront. Splitting channels means ultimately emphasizing online at the expense of offline and offline at the expense of online. When in reality, what you want to do is give the customer whatever they want when they want. So if I want to walk into a store, try on shirts, and then buy them online, figure out a way to help me in that process. Don't separate those channels so that the individuals within them are incentivized to make me do that purchase in one channel or another. View it as this holistic element. I think that's really important and super significant, and we're going to be discussing it a lot in the next year. A big part of that is just the lack of understanding of how do we make the case for Omni? How do we make the case for the marketing value of a store? I know we discussed this a couple of times already today, but one of the biggest issues is we don't have this way of communicating how significant our physical locations are to our wider retail mix, and how they kind of cross-pollinate, and how the strength in one area drives strength in another. So that's something that we need to do much better at. And that's a tactic that we think is going to really define those who succeed in the coming year. Another element is this store in store, but I'd call it all these smaller store concepts. So whether it's Ulta in Target, Sephora in Kohl's, which to me is the most interesting and maybe the definingly interesting move of 2021 was Sephora's move into Kohl's. But even things like Bloomies, like these small format stores or Market by Macy's, this is going to be something really significant, because it's brands trying to say, how do I take this strength that I have and figure out how to reach different markets without having to fundamentally shift who I am. So a small format store allows me to go into areas that don't stand up to my classic kind of flagship system. Now, sometimes these shifts have kind of taken the shape of, like, I don't know, Nordstrom's does their Nordstrom rack. So it's an off-price concept. But what's interesting about a Bloomies is it's a very natural evolution of Bloomingdale's. It's not a fundamentally different thing. It's not like I have luxury and off-price. I have my big format and my small format, one that sits on a high street and one that sits in a mall. And that mix seems to be a really powerful one that we're going to expect to see more brands chase after. And the last bit is this idea of what we're calling disciplined expansion. So I think what we've taught, what tends to grab the headlines are things like, Sephora going into Kohl's. It's really interesting. How am I going to expand? I'm going to find this new channel. What I don't think we talk enough about is the brands that are really focused on what they provide and using that to get from being a really sizable regional chain to being a national powerhouse. So take Dutch Bros, another kind of coffee player. They're not shifting their model to try and catch Starbucks in the third place. They're staying to this, hey, quick in, quick out, drive-through, takeaway oriented model that allows them to succeed. Planet Fitness is another great example. We know who we are. We're not trying to shift it. We are a $10, a month gym. I don't need to add classes. I'm not adding a pool. I'm going to be part of your mix. Here's why. That focus is really important as we see that, and it's driving a lot of success for those who can remain disciplined in their expansion process.
Yeah. Well, this whole thing about, the stores within stores is just, I really do believe it's the future, Ethan, as well as your point about the small store strategies. Because one of the reasons that they can do this is the technology and AI help Bloomies know exactly what consumer preferences are within a neighborhood. Target, the same thing on campus and so forth. So you are right on there in terms of where the success is going to lie in the future. So what do the expansions mean specifically?
I think it depends on the brands we're talking about. I think there are certain ones that there are surprises that we think are on the way. And there are some that, I think are a little bit, tougher to believe, but there are ones that we feel pretty strongly about. And I'll give you a few examples. So we're big believers that Tuesday Morning and Bed Bath & Beyond, as examples, have a much brighter future than maybe their current present. And a big part of that is really strong alignment with trends, in the sense that home improvement, home furnishings has maintained its strength. So if, the DIY project has maybe fallen off a bit, the place that sells you the items for your home has not. So Home Goods is one of the great performers that we've seen in the last year. And I think this idea that brands like Tuesday Morning and Bed Bath & Beyond fit this kind of really interesting lane is significant. And so they're not ones we would bet against. In fact, we think they could have much better years than many expect. Take another space like, look at Gap. Gap had a rough earnings recently, but if you actually look at the numbers, Gap same-store sales were up Old Navy was the brand that took a hit, and Old Navy, and Athleta's still very, very strong. Old Navy is usually one of the stronger performers for that company. And one of the reasons they got hit was because of supply chain issues. So if I'm a more value-oriented retailer, that shrinking of the margin is going to obviously impact my revenue more than one who's a little bit more upmarket. So there is this opportunity for some of these brands, especially considering the growing margins, to maybe surprise in the coming year. And Gap is very high on our list of brands that we think could take a lot of people by surprise. Another space is, like we talked about before, is the department store sector. We're a lot more bullish on the continued value of a Macy's or a Nordstrom's than many others were. And it's because of the discovery process. Like we said, the biggest value of going into a physical location is getting to touch and feel things and see a lot of stuff in one space. And especially considering the fact that many of the top malls are shrinking the amount of apparel they're dedicating to a specific mall. So if there was 100 stores for apparel, now they'll have 50 or 60. That's going to give added weight to the department store as a place where I can see a lot of different things in one space. And so, yes, there are changes they need to make and evolutions they need to go through. But in terms of being positioned to do better than many expect, I think this is one of those sectors. And I think the last one, and we don't have it on this slide, is the office supply space. I mean, we've been banging this drum for a while and maybe not looking all that smart by doing so. But if we're going to be working more from home, we're going to need someone to provide that. And thus far, they've been slow to meet that mix. But the fact that they've done a smart job of trying to efficiently right-size themselves, because there's this opportunity, this is a sector with a little bit of innovation, a little bit of aggressiveness. There are channels for it to grow really significantly in the coming year.
So, before we get to questions, your point about the department stores is very important, Ethan, because we all know that they for several decades the department store model has been in the decline in terms of share of market across the industry. But as you're pointing out, this whole point about discovery is something if they can get their minds around it, understand it, and really kind of reposition their strategies to play to that angle. I agree. I think they have a huge opportunity. Anyway, so fascinating stuff.
Robin, it can't be clunky. I think one of the problems with a lot of department store experiences is that it feels, I go to a table, there's interesting stuff going on. The next table is completely empty and everything's a mess. We need to figure out how to make that in-store experience actually serve the discovery process. Because if it does, I mean, look at, again, a smaller company that I really have a tremendous amount of appreciation for is Neighborhood Goods. They figured out a way to make discovery really interesting and cool and forward thinking.
Yep.
That's a department store. I think department stores, and one of the things we sometimes forget is the brand value. It's much harder to build a brand that people know than to reposition a brand and kind of, people will give it a second chance. We saw it with Target. Target is a strip center department store, and they've taken themselves from something that wasn't all that exciting to maybe the most exciting retailer in the entire landscape.
Yep. They've done a brilliant job. And to kind of sign off on this idea of discovery, for forever, the off-price model has been all about discovery. I mean, women will go into a Marshalls or TJ Maxx, and will spend hours in discovering, finding. It's a treasure hunt, right? They go there to find a great designer dress, for practically nothing. So the department stores are a great opportunity. All right, I guess we can go to some questions, right?
Absolutely.
And I think Deborah, hi. Deborah.
Hi,
there
guys.
she is. She's the arbiter, the whatever
The
of everything.
Okay, so one question, Ethan, is very pragmatic. One of our viewers wants to know that, or have you explained, Walmart and Target don't publish their traffic numbers in their stores. Is there a source for this data?
So the source is Placer. So that's what
I figured. But
that's what we do. I mean, we publish. I mean, again, we look at location data. So it's that visit. It's all the things surrounding that visit. Where does it come from? Where is it going to after? How long is it spending in a location? What's the cross-shopping patterns? And we're able to kind of aggregate that up from a per location level to kind of the wider chain nationwide. And so all the data that you're seeing comes from our system, which is, why we're able to show it.
Cool. Great tee-up question. So there's a question sort of in two parts. It's more nuanced about both you and Robin talking about the value of department stores. You mentioned their billboards. It's a reminder that we're there, the whole discovery process. But one of the viewers wants to know, is there really hope for the non-essentials, the traditional department stores? Because is it a profitable proposition to keep the operations of a physical store going for it basically to be a showroom, a place of discovery?
So it's a very good question. I guess it depends on the curation process. So I think there's a natural shift that's happening between the brands that don't want to be in department stores are leaving, right? So, we saw it was a big story throughout, last year and early this year, which partners Nike was leaving behind and which ones it was keeping.
Right.
But the relationships that it was keeping were still providing value. Levi's was the same, by the way. We talk a lot about how their wholesale business was declining at the expense of their kind of own direct-to-consumer business. So I think as long as these department stores can maintain the experience that's positive, you can still, it's not, again, discovery is clearly an important piece of the puzzle, but you can still drive conversions with discovery. But I think there's also elements of, there's shifts that I don't think we've made yet. So we talk a lot about, and even take Nordstrom. Nordstrom in their recent earnings, overall, the Nordstrom flagship was up, and they were up pretty significantly in terms of same-store sales. Nordstrom Rack was down, right? But Nordstrom, so these luxury items, these luxury brands, are they doing enough to kind of really embrace luxury? Are they doing appointment shopping during the week where I can go and meet with a personal shopper at 2:00 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, and they'll walk me around the store? Because it's not a packed house anyway at 2:00 on a Wednesday. And that's a way to improve the likelihood of conversions and an increased basket size. So not only is discovery is an amazing pull and it will draw someone into the store, but then it's on these brands to figure out, all right, now how do we convert them? How do we create experiences to convert as well? So I think they have this unique asset, and now it's about how do you kind of fill the rest of the story?
Okay, so tangential to this, we write a lot about the Great Resignation, which seems to be the retail story, hospitality, but principally retail. Everything that you've just mentioned about the experience in a physical store is pretty dependent on a decent sales staff and the people who serve customers. So what is your opinion and even advice about what's going on in terms of this resignation of basically salespeople who are not happy and not fulfilled and don't feel that they have a meaningful role in this larger enterprise? And it's going to end up upending everything that you're talking about in terms of the value of a physical store.
Sure, but it's because many of them don't. We spoke think about, if I'm an in-store salesperson and my job is to give you this great experience, right? I mean, again, let's take myself. I'm not a big in-store shopper. It's not my favorite thing to do. If I can find an item that I love in a store and then buy it online after that, that makes me much happier. Am I making sure that the sales, as a kind of an owner of a retailer, am I making sure that the sales staff is incentivized to give me the best possible experience no matter where I buy? Am I doing my best to make sure that I recognize the fact that, hey, Sandy helped Ethan find this shirt and then he bought 7 more times online? Is Sandy getting a benefit from that? Probably not at all. And so if we're not valuing them for all of the value that they can provide, why are we so surprised they're not providing all that much value and that they want to leave? So I think it's on the retailers to try and really grapple with this equation of how do we understand the wider experience in the best possible way so that we make our sales staff happier, so that we're able to reward the right behaviors, so we're able to make the customer more likely to have a great experience and then stick with us in the long term.
Also, I'd like to jump in and add to Ethan's point of view. Blake Nordstrom, God bless him, he's passed away, but many conversations with him, he said, Robin, we can train new employees to train them about the retail business. But what we can't do is train them to have empathy and train them how to deal with customers and make the experience terrific. They're just nice human beings. And he said, so that's what we look for in terms of when they hire. So I think that makes a difference too. And that's probably why Nordstrom to this day has one of the greatest reputations for service and customer experience. Anyway, throw that in there.
All great. And it seems like this is a fundamental issue that needs to get fixed after the last year and a half that we've been enduring. And then there's one last question here that's, it's sort of a new modeling type of question. Is it fair to compare 2020 and even 2021 to 2019? Are we going to have to come up with new benchmarks in terms of success because of the pandemic and the sustained amount of time that we're going through this? I mean, is it fair to go back 2 years ago or 3 years ago?
Of course not. I think, but it's the best you have. And so there is this, I think we are in a very, comparisons and analysis require more nuance than ever. And it's again, because of what we were discussing before. So if a company is doing incredibly well because of the pandemic, are we going to punish them because they had a bit of a down year afterwards? It doesn't mean they're worse. It means that, they took advantage of an opportunity and now they're normalizing. That's not something we want to say is bad. That's something we should be applauding. And I think the same is true for, a company that did really poorly because of the pandemic, but then bounces back to normal. It's not the growth that compared to that valley that matters most. It's the fact that they were able to get back to a certain position that we should be kind of applauding. So I think it's, even year-over-year metrics include lots of problems. I'll give you a great example. We were speaking to someone earlier this year who was looking at data of February year-over-year and saying, oh, wow, this retailer did really badly. And we looked at the data and we said, just so you're aware, there was one less day in February this year than there was last year. And also this retailer has the bulk of their stores in Texas, and Texas was hit incredibly hard by these really significant storms for like a week and a half, 2 weeks. So it obviously limited this brand tremendously. And then it was like, oh, wow, you forget. So I think we need to try to be a little bit more, and like, obviously this is somewhat of a plug for our data, but there are resources available to allow us to be more insightful faster. And so the question is, are we taking advantage of them? And are we trying to view the story for all of its all of its perspectives? I'll throw in one more of like, you think about like Sears closing and how much of this retail apocalypse narrative was based on a fairly small number of brands that had a huge number of stores that were closing. As opposed to, and then now, we're seeing the flip side of like, oh, more stores are opening than closing. Everything's better than it ever has been before. And the former isn't true and the latter isn't true. Things were never as bad as we thought they were. And they're probably not always as amazing as we might say they are. It's usually somewhere in between. And the more we can provide a nuanced perspective, and I'll shout out because I love that article. Deborah, I messaged you about it. The article on your website about the kind of splitting online and offline, because it does just that. It doesn't attempt to kind of bash an idea as out of hand terrible. It explains what is the challenge with it. And I think the more nuanced we are in approaching these issues, the better the answers we're going to come up with.
Good. So finally, one last question. Do you ever correlate what's going on with behavioral data among consumers in terms of the physical data that you track? So for example, the move for DEI, the whole mandate for sustainability, all of the pressures that next gens are putting on retail leaders. I mean, do they talk about politics? Do they take a stand on social justice? Do they do any of these things? Or is any of that factored in terms of the insights that you provide? So
I'll give you we were really interested in this question a few years ago. There was a newsworthy moment when one of the founders of Home Depot came out and publicly declared his support for President Trump at the time.
We know.
And we were really fascinated by this. We're like, will this create a difference in, overall? The answer was no. Maybe this will create a difference in areas that are very pro-Republican or very pro-Democrat. Maybe that will be the difference. And the answer was no. And I think what we find is that when we're talking about these nationwide large chains, the thing that they're doing, positive or negative, needs to be huge in order to drive a significant difference. And that in most cases, it's not the biggest factor. It's not a noticeable difference. Now, obviously, smaller brands might be more significant. They might create a dedicated following. But at that, when we're looking at kind of the Targets, the Walmarts, the Home Depots and Lowe's of the world, it's pretty difficult to find any correlation with shifts in traffic and these kind of more top line stories.
So would you say that next gens and the demands that we, in all transparency, write about all the time, is it just surface noise?
No, I think it matters, and I think it matters especially in the sense that it's driving a wider change in retail. I think it's difficult to assess how significant. So you can't say, hey, they saw a 10% lift because they care about the environment. I do think you can say that the fact that certain audiences are very oriented to certain, socially conscious issues is creating a wider change, and that change is probably very positive.
Thanks. That's the end of my line of questions from our audience. So thank you. As always, it's fascinating to hear what you say. It's just incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're fabulous. And as I said, I think you've got some insights and observations that I don't hear from most of the experts I know, including myself.
Well, thank you. This is always something I look forward to. It's always great to talk with you. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
So will you be coming back with us at some point in the future, I hope?
Of course.
Great.
Thank you so much.
And thanks everybody in the audience for joining us. And I guess that's a wrap.
Take care.